Hi, I'm Brett from papercartridges.com at the shop today in beautiful downtown Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And on the desk today is a Model 1860 Fusilier this is a version of the Dreyse needle rifle. And this one is a Model 1860. And I was recently at the range shooting it. And you can't help but draw attention to yourself when you're shooting a Dreyse needle rifle. And I had people come over and start asking questions, and I explained to one of them that this was a rifle model from 1860, and he asked, well, did we use these in the American Civil War? Because 1860 was the year before the American Civil War began. And I thought that is actually a really good question for the professor of musketry. So whenever we cover one of these deep dives into history and context, out comes the Tweed. But that really is a very good question because this is a bolt action breech loading rifle. You can fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute. You can shoot it from the prone. You have the same rate of fire with this as you do from, say, like the trapdoor Springfield. So if this existed before 1860, before the American Civil War, why didn't we use the needle rifle in the American Civil War? Were Civil War ordnance officers just too ignorant or too stupid or too stubborn to adopt this new technology? Uh, and and it's true that they could be. There's lots of stuff to criticize the Ordnance Department for in the years up to and in the Civil War. But not adopting a needle rifle is really not a valid reason to criticize them for. They considered it and they decided not to adopt one rationally, not out of stubbornness or ignorance, but for intelligent reasons. And there's four reasons why I think that the U.S. Army did not adopt a needle rifle before 1861, before the start of the Civil War. So the first reason is that when our Civil War begins in April of 1861, the needle rifle is actually still untested in real war. The gun is still technically a Prussian state secret. It's like their ace in the hole. Prussia is surrounded by a bunch of large empires, and they have this potential combat multiplier, and they've kept it sort of under wraps. They haven't issued it out to the entire army. So it hasn't seen much combat use. It did in the revolutions of 1858, very small numbers, and then in the First Schleswig War, 1849 to 1851, it was used in very limited numbers, but not in large scale. So before the American Civil War, the needle rifle is really just a theory. No one knows how this is actually going to stand up in actual war. The second reason is by 1861, no other country had adopted a needle rifle. Now, a lot of people had tested it, but they had all come to the same conclusion that these just aren't for us. The British gave it a very serious look. So after adopting the pattern 1851 Minié rifle, they start looking for an improved infantry rifle, and they eventually would adopt the pattern 1853 Enfield, but they did consider the needle rifle, and they had some needle rifles made in England, and they're really curious looking because they look like a needle rifle back here, but the front of the gun looks like a Brown Bess with the pinned and keyed stock. Really unusual looking thing. I think those are still at the Royal Armouries. We got to twist Jonathan Ferguson's arm to bring them out for us. But the British decide after testing them that these really aren't for us, and they go, of course, with a conventional pattern 1853 Enfield rifle musket instead of a needle rifle. The third reason, before 1861, U.S. Ordnance Department had carefully weighed the potential advantages of the needle rifle against its objections. And they listed these pros and cons kind of in a decision matrix. And they very rationally looked at this and they determined that it's really about a tie. The advantages basically are balanced out by all the disadvantages. And most of this work was done by a kind of a hero of mine, Major Alfred Mordecai, who was a U.S. Army Ordnance officer, go Ordnance, a absolute world-class expert on everything arms, ammunition, small arms, artillery. I mean, this guy He knew his stuff, an absolute consummate expert. So he was one of the three officers sent to Europe to go observe the Crimean War. And while over there, he visited Prussia, and he's very interested. So this is 1855, right around the same time that we are wrapping up our own experiments to determine what rifle we're going to adopt for the United States, which of course became the Model 1855 rifle musket. But he's really interested in the Dreyse needle rifle, and he's working on a report to send back to the United States on what what Americans should copy from Europe, because that's what we do really, really well in the American Army is we copy what they're doing in Europe. So he's very interested, and he speaks with Prussian officers. And again, this is the 1855, 1856. The Prussian officers are very excited about the needle rifle. They say this thing is really good, and we want it to be issued to the whole army because at this time the Prussian soldiers are still armed rank and file. They still have a smoothbore musket. So the Prussian officers like it. They hope it gets adopted, but it's still not in service. And Mordecai gets hold of a German officer, actually a Saxon officer's published assessment on the needle rifle. And that's where he draws most of his pros and cons. So we know a lot of the advantages. So it's the rate of fire is the key advantage. You can shoot it from the prone. It's a breech loader. You can take the bolt out, so it's real easy to clean. Uh, but the cons are you kind of have to leave the 21st century behind when you consider the negative aspects of the needle rifle. Because if today we look at the what we would call the cons of the needle rifle, and we would kind of scoff, like, really, that was an objection. So take your 2023 glasses off and consider this as you would a mid 19th century ordnance officer. The number one objection to the needle rifle is its rate of fire, which is also its key advantage. So it's considered a double-edged sword in the 1850s. But consider it, in the 1850s, ammunition is very scarce. It's because it's handmade, it's very heavy. And you don't just have a Bradley or an LMTV or a PLS back there loaded with ammo, that the FSC is going to come bring you when you need it. Your ammo can be miles away on a wagon or a cart, or it might not even be there. It might be back 50 miles away, and the railroad might get it somewhere close to you. But if you fire all your ammunition off in a very short amount of time, you're out of ammo, and resupply is not guaranteed. Uh, a needle rifle can fire all of your ammo off in 5 minutes. So if you have nervous soldiers that aren't under strict supervision, they can be defenseless. All of their ammo can be gone really before anyone knows what's going on. And so that's a major concern. Even for the Prussians themselves, the Prussians were very worried about this, and the only way they got around it was by instilling intense fire discipline on their troops, that you only fire upon the command of your leaders. And only at very rare occasions do you switch into what the Prussians call Schnellfeuer. And that's where you are loading and firing as fast as you can. But the rest of the time, you are loading and firing in strict obedience to the orders from your officers. Major Mordecai considered some other objections. The needle rifle is expensive. It's far more complicated in its construction. It needs a lot of machined parts. It's got a bolt. It has the needle assembly. And it also uses a spiral spring, which is among the first of its kind. Very, very few firearms prior to the needle rifle had ever used a spiral spring. We know all about leaf springs in the 1860s, but we're a little nervous about this new spiral spring. How long is that going to hold up? Is it going to get weak? So they didn't really trust them. Another concern is the needle itself. So how the needle rifle works is that long firing pin punches through the gunpowder and hits the primer at the base of the bullet. So the needle is exposed to the heat and pressure in the chamber when the gun is firing. Over time, that can weaken the needle. It can bend and break. Now, soldiers can switch the needle out real fast. It's quick to do, maybe 15, 20 seconds. but that's still another consideration. And finally, the needle rifle, the Dreyse, does not fully obturate the breech. Now, there's a myth that the gas blows back in the soldier's face and they had to shoot it from the hip. That's not true. The gas that does leak always gets vented forward. It can't go back because of the shape of the connection to the breech to the bolt face. But it does leak gas, and the more you fire it, the more gas it leaks. So the gun gets more and more inaccurate the longer you shoot it because of the gas leakage. And the fourth reason, and this is the primary reason why the US Army decided not to adopt a needle rifle, is that by 1861, the US Army already had a better gun. The Dreyse was an inferior weapon to the US Model 1855 or 1861 rifle musket. And you go, whoa, wait a minute, Mr. Bullet Nerd Guy. The 1861 is a muzzleloader. A soldier can get maybe 3 shots off a minute, and the Dreyse, you can crank 6, maybe 8 or more. And that's true, but rate of fire is not everything. So think about it. The Dreyse was initially developed by Nikolaus von Dreyse in the late 1820s and 1830s. The Prussians adopt a military model in 1841, which is 20 years before the start of the American Civil War. And this is the 19th century where weapons technology is changing at an absolutely blistering pace. Uh, New designs are being adopted and fielded, and they're obsolete within 5 to 10 years. So you've got the Dreyse, the Prussian model 1841, uh, and it's really good against the potential adversaries Prussia would be facing in 1841, which would be like Russians armed with a smoothbore flintlock musket that's good to what, maybe 150 yards max effective range of a flintlock smoothbore musket. Well, this is a rifle, and it's a large bore rifle, which is common for 1841, and it fired a big, clunky, acorn-shaped bullet at really low velocity. But it's still good. You can still hit like a man-sized target to about 200 yards. So your gun can hit the enemy, and the enemy with their flintlock smoothbores can't hit you. So excellent advantage by 1841 standards. Fast forward 20 years, we're now in 1861. By this point, new rifle muskets are being generally adopted all over Europe and in the United States. So the British have the P-53 Enfield. We have the Model 1855 and soon to be Model 1861 Springfield. Austrians have the Model 1854 Lorenz. And these new rifle muskets, they have much higher muzzle velocity and they're much more accurate. They have about twice the effective range as the needle rifle. So think slow rate of fire, that's true. But if you're 400 yards away from someone, what do you want? Do you want a Mac 10 that you can just dump the magazine in, what, like a second and a half? Or do you want a deer rifle? You know, Grandpa's 30-40 Krag with the nice sights on it. Yeah, the Mac 10 is going to shoot rounds a lot faster, but that's not going to do you much good at 400 yards. You'll take the deer rifle. Now, if I'm in an elevator, I'm going with the Mac 10, but you get my point. And Prussia keenly understands this. They realized that by the mid 1850s, they realized that this Wunderwaffen is now obsolete. So they somewhat desperately upgrade the ammunition. And that's what's here. This is the Model 1855 cartridge. And they seat the bullet in a discarding sabot. And the Prussians were using discarding sabots long before it was cool. But that does increase the velocity of the bullet, which increases the danger space of the bullet, which means you're a little bit more effective out now to maybe 300 yards. And I was shooting this just the other day at 300 yards and putting hits on a soldier-sized target at that distance. But it's still not ideal. This desperate stopgap measure of making the bullet smaller, putting it in a sabot, only buys you a little bit of time. And in 1861, the U.S. Army is looking at the needle rifle. before the new improved ammunition was really known to American ordnance officers. And we're considering we've got a much better gun, our Model 1855 rifle. A trained soldier can hit a man-sized target out to 500 yards, and formation-sized targets like a column of infantry, you can hit that as long as you're trained and you can estimate the distance. You can hit that out to 900 or 1,000 yards. And so we believed we had a better service rifle than the Dreyse. And we did not know in 1861 that the American Civil War is going to be fought with a bunch of volunteers and not professional, long-standing armies. So what happened in the Civil War, you have all these volunteers, they are not trained, and so Civil War battles are up close and nasty. The Dreyse probably would have been very, very handy in some of these 100-yard battle engagements we saw in the Civil War. But before the war, when these decisions were being made, everyone's anticipating that the future war is going to be fought at 300 yards, 400 yards, because that's what was happening in the Crimean War. And in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British are regularly opening fire with ordinary infantry with Enfield rifle muskets at 400 or 500 yards effectively. So you can't blame them for for not knowing what they didn't know. And you might also go, oh, whoa, whoa, stop, Mr. Bullet Nerd guy. What about the Austrians in 1866? Because the Prussians had the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr in 1866, and the Austrians had their old muzzleloader, and the Dreyse cleaned their clocks. So how come, if this is really obsolete and the new rifle muskets were more advanced, how come the Dreyse won? That is a great question, and I'm going to cover that in a future another future nerdy gun history project to peel back the long-standing myth that Prussia won just because it had the breechloader and Austria lost because they had the muzzleloader. And you'll have to wait for that full video when I explain just why and how Austria lost. I'll give you a spoiler. You can break it down into 3 words: Moltke, Auftragstaktik, und Stoßtaktik. If you understand that, you'll probably know where I'm going. But anyway, before the Civil War, the U.S. Ordnance Department was not impressed with the Dreyse. It had a short range, it's not very accurate, and its rate of fire is that double-edged sword. I mean, our soldiers can shoot all their ammo off in 4 or 5 minutes, and then now what? So that is why Civil War armies did not use the needle rifle. And if you want Brett's opinion, at 150 yards or less, I'll take the Dreyse because I can probably still hit you at that distance, and I can load and fire from the prone and shoot quick. But anywhere beyond 150 yards, honestly, I would feel a lot better with any of the conventional rifle muskets. So give me an 1861 Springfield, an Enfield, a Lorenz. I would be more comfortable at longer range. So rate of fire is not always everything. But I am Brett from papercartridges.com. If you enjoyed this little nerdy walk down some Civil War ordnance context and history, I appreciate a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.